We know that high-dose melphalan chemotherapy supported by autologous stem cell transplant is an important standard of care for eligible patients with newly diagnosed myeloma. We also know that the lenalidomide, bortezomib, dexamethasone three-drug strategy for newly diagnosed myeloma patients is incredibly important and has performed well not only in patients who are eligible for transplant with newly diagnosed disease, but those who are not eligible for transplant as well. So the RVD backbone has become, probably the most frequently utilized standard of care regimen for newly diagnosed multiple myeloma patients, not only in the United States, but in some other countries as well. We know that when we add the CD38 monoclonal antibody daratumumab to lenalidomide and dexamethasone in the relapse setting, that we improve depth of response as well as progression-free survival. And similarly, when we do the same thing in newly diagnosed myeloma patients, improvement in depth of response and progression-free survival. We also know that when we add daratumumab to bortezomib-based therapy, both in the relapse setting as well as newly diagnosed setting, that again, we improve depth of response as well as progression-free survival for those patients. So it's a natural extension to look at combining daratumumab with the Revlimid, Velcade, dexamethasone backbone in newly diagnosed myeloma patients. So the Griffin Trial is a randomized phase 2 study which is looking at the addition of daratumumab with the RVD backbone for transplant-eligible myeloma patients. So the randomized phase 2 portion of the study will be presented here at ASH with updated results. This was originally presented at the IMW meeting in Boston back in September. The way that the study was designed is that patients were assigned one-to-one randomly to either treatment with standard of care RVD versus RVD with the introduction of daratumumab. For those patients on the control arm, they received 4 3-week cycles of RVD induction therapy. They then underwent stem cell collection and mobilization with GCSF, with or without the use of plerixafor. They then underwent stem cell transplant with high-dose melphalan. When they recovered from that, they got 2 3-week cycles of RVD consolidation therapy, followed by Revlimid or lenalidomide maintenance therapy until disease progression or the emergence of unacceptable side effects. The daratumumab arm went through the same treatment regimen with the inclusion of daratumumab, where we gave weekly dosing of dara during the induction phase of treatment on day 1 of consolidation, and then on day 1 of each 4-week maintenance cycle. The daratumumab was continued for 2 years, and patients were encouraged to stay on lenalidomide maintenance therapy until the emergence of unacceptable side effects or disease progression. Now, treatment outcomes for newly diagnosed myeloma patients have become, increasingly better over the course of time, and median progression-free survival in some of the transplant studies in newly diagnosed myeloma patients are reporting median progression-free survival rates as good as 50 months. So there's a pressing need for surrogate clinical endpoints that can predict longitudinal outcomes for newly diagnosed myeloma patients. And in that regard, depth of response, as assessed by either stringent complete response or minimal residual disease testing, has emerged as very important strategies, to achieve that goal. So the primary endpoint of our study was achievement of stringent complete response by the end of consolidation therapy after transplant. Secondary objectives included assessment of minimal residual disease status, other clinical efficacy parameters, as well as safety. At the time of the IMW meeting in Boston back in September, what we reported at that time was that we had met our primary objective. In other words, we had seen an improvement in stringent complete response in the DARA arm by the end of consolidation at a 42.4% compared to 32% for those in the control arm. With longer follow-up of a little over 22 months, the improvement, we see continued improvement in stringent complete response in the DARA arm, so we're up to 63% in contrast to 45% for those on the control arm. When you look at MRD status at the end of consolidation, we're looking at 50% MRD negative rate measured at 10 to the minus 5 with NGS testing in the DARA arm, in contrast to 20% for those on the control arm. We're getting an early readout of progression-free and overall survival at this meeting. So 2 years into therapy, the progression-free survival in the Dara arm is close to 96%, and it's just shy of 90% for those in the control arm. And overall survival at 2 years is approximately 96% and 93% for the Dara arm and control arm, respectively. And then as far as side effects are concerned, we did not encounter anything unexpected. So we did see more neutropenia on the Dara arm of the trial, which we would have expected based on other studies. There was an increased rate of infection, so approximately 90% of patients in the Dara arm, again, median follow-up of close to 2 years, experienced any grade infection compared to 60% for those on the control arm. However, when you look at serious infections, grade 3 and higher, it was in the low 20s% range for both arms of the study. There were no issues with regards to stem cell collection, and median time to engraftment was the same in both arms of the study. So I think it's, to suffice it to say, that the addition of Daratumumab to the RVD backbone has improved, depth of response in a transplant setting in newly diagnosed myeloma patients, as assessed by stringent complete response and MRD negativity. So I think we've provided, some good fuel for the early adopters of therapy here in the United States to potentially start using this quadruplet. However, the only cautionary note that I would make is that we need to verify that these MRD negative rates that we're seeing in the Dara arm are maintained over the course of time. So sustained MRD negativity is going to be important. And it's also going to be important to verify that this improvement in depth of response actually translates into an improvement in progression-free survival. And in that regard, we're going to need to just follow this over a longer period of time. I will also note that there is a phase 3 study called the Voorhees trial, which has completed enrollment in Europe. And it's basically a very similar construct to the Griffin study, the only difference it being a randomized phase 3 as opposed to a randomized phase 2 study, and they are powered to see a difference in progression-free survival between the two arms.